It was late in the afternoon when General Marcus Brown, a highly respected officer in the United States Army, began his drive home from a leadership conference. The event had been an important gathering of military minds where strategies, future challenges, and training programs were discussed. Marcus had been one of the keynote speakers, sharing his years of experience and wisdom with younger officers. After hours of discussions and handshakes, he finally settled into his car, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction. The road stretched out in front of him, calm and ordinary, a welcome contrast to the high-pressure environment he usually worked in. The general, dressed in a simple suit rather than his uniform, blended in with everyday drivers on the highway. His car was modest, nothing flashy, and the windows were rolled down slightly to let in the cool evening air. He hummed softly to the rhythm of a song playing on the radio, enjoying a rare moment of peace. For a man who carried enormous responsibilities, these quiet drives were often the only time he had to himself. As he entered a small town along the route, the atmosphere shifted. The streets grew narrower, traffic lights blinked at every corner, and a few people lingered outside shops and gas stations. Marcus slowed down, obeying the posted speed limits. He had always been disciplined about rules, not just in the military but in everyday life. To him, structure and order created safety. Yet, despite his careful driving, a police cruiser suddenly pulled out from behind a convenience store and began following him closely. At first, Marcus thought nothing of it. Police cars often patrolled neighborhoods, and he respected law enforcement deeply. But when the flashing red and blue lights came on, his calm was disrupted. He glanced into the rearview mirror, his trained instincts instantly sharpening. After years of service, he had learned to remain composed under pressure, whether on the battlefield or on the road. He pulled his car over to the side carefully, parking under a streetlight so everything would be visible. The officer stepped out of the cruiser with a brisk, almost confrontational stride. Marcus noticed the way the man's shoulders were squared, his hand resting on his belt near his holster. The officer approached quickly, tapping on the window with more force than necessary. Marcus lowered the window, greeting him with the same calm courtesy he offered anyone. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" he asked politely. Instead of answering directly, the officer narrowed his eyes. "License and registration," he demanded, his voice sharp. Marcus reached slowly into his wallet and glove compartment, handing over the documents without hesitation. He knew better than to make sudden moves. His years of discipline made every gesture measured and clear. The officer barely glanced at the papers before leaning closer, peering inside the car. "What brings you through here?" the officer asked, his tone less about curiosity and more about suspicion. Marcus replied evenly. "I'm returning home from a military conference in the city, just passing through on my way back." But his calm explanation seemed to have no effect. The officer frowned, studying him as though looking for a reason not to believe him. Around them, a few people walking by slowed down to watch. It wasn't unusual for a traffic stop to draw attention, especially in a small town where everyone knew each other. The general kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, maintaining eye contact without being confrontational. He had been in situations overseas where mistrust filled the air, and he recognized the same tension now, though the circumstances were very different. Minutes ticked by, and the officer continued asking questions that felt less like routine procedure and more like interrogation. "Where exactly are you headed? Why are you driving this route? Who do you work for?" Each time, Marcus answered with patience. "I live about 2 hours from here. This is the most direct route, and I work for the United States Army." The officer raised an eyebrow, skeptical. "The Army, huh? What's your rank then?" "I am a general," Marcus answered truthfully, his voice steady. The officer chuckled, shaking his head as though dismissing the claim. "A general driving around here in an ordinary car? That's hard to believe." Marcus said nothing more. He had no desire to argue. Years of leadership had taught him that dignity was best maintained in silence when words would only be wasted. Yet despite his composure, he felt a heaviness in his chest. He was not just any citizen. He was a man who had given his entire life to the service of his country. And still, here he was, facing doubt and disrespect from someone who was supposed to uphold fairness. The situation grew more uncomfortable as the officer stepped back and circled the car, peering into the windows as if expecting to find something wrong. Marcus stayed still, hands on the wheel, eyes forward. People nearby whispered quietly. Sensing that the stop was more than just routine, the general's thoughts wandered briefly to the countless young soldiers he had mentored. He often reminded them that integrity meant staying calm under pressure, no matter how unfair the situation seemed. Now those very words echoed back to him as a test of his own strength. After circling the car, the officer returned to the driver's side. His face remained stern, but his voice carried a hint of provocation. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Marcus hesitated for a fraction of a second, then unbuckled his seatbelt and opened the door. He moved with deliberate calm, standing tall under the glow of the streetlight. Even without his uniform, his bearing carried authority. Still, the officer seemed unimpressed. He looked Marcus up and down as if trying to find flaws that would justify his actions. "Do you have any other form of identification?" the officer pressed. "Yes," Marcus replied, reaching slowly into his pocket and pulling out his official military ID card. He handed it over respectfully. The officer glanced at it quickly but shook his head. "This doesn't mean much to me. Could be fake for all I know." A small crowd had now gathered at a distance, murmuring among themselves. Some recognized Marcus's calm confidence and began to wonder if the officer had gone too far. But Marcus himself remained silent, steady as a mountain. He knew that every second of this encounter mattered, not just for him but for the example it would set. The evening air grew cooler, and the streetlights flickered on fully as darkness spread across the town. The general stood there, his hands relaxed by his sides, watching the officer deliberate. His heart was steady, his face calm, but inside, he knew this was only the beginning of a long and challenging encounter. And though he had not yet made any call or revealed his true power, Marcus understood one thing clearly. Sometimes the greatest battles were not fought on foreign soil but on ordinary streets, where respect and justice were put to the test. The cool night breeze carried with it a heavy silence as Marcus stood by his car, the glow of the streetlights casting long shadows around him. The small crowd that had gathered remained at a distance, whispering and pointing, unsure of what exactly was happening but sensing that something was not right. For Marcus, the moment felt strangely surreal. He had faced dangerous missions overseas, led soldiers in some of the most complex operations, and earned the respect of leaders across the world. Yet here he was in his own country on an ordinary street, being questioned as though he were a criminal. The officer continued to study him, flipping the military identification card between his fingers with casual doubt. "I asked you who you were," the officer said again, his tone laced with impatience. "And you expect me to believe this?" He waved the card slightly, almost mocking it. Marcus took a quiet breath before answering. "That is my official identification. It confirms everything I've told you. I am a general in the United States Army." But his calm explanation seemed to fuel the officer's stubbornness. The man shook his head. "You think a small-town cop like me is just going to take your word for it? Not a chance. This doesn't add up. People don't just drive through here claiming to be generals. You're hiding something." Marcus felt the words cut, but he didn't allow it to show on his face. He knew that reacting emotionally would only make the situation worse. Instead, he remained steady, watching as the officer's suspicion grew. "Turn around," the officer ordered suddenly. Marcus raised his eyebrows slightly, surprised at how quickly the situation had escalated. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I've cooperated fully, given you my license, registration, and military identification. There's no cause for you. Turn around," the officer repeated, his voice sharper now. The crowd stirred uneasily, their whispers growing louder. Some pulled out phones, uncertain whether to record or not. The atmosphere thickened with tension, the quiet town street suddenly feeling like a stage for something much larger than a simple traffic stop. Marcus hesitated only a second longer before deciding not to resist. With slow, deliberate movements, he turned as instructed. His posture remained dignified, his shoulders straight, his head held high. He had endured countless inspections and drills. He would endure this too. The officer reached for his cuffs and placed them on Marcus's wrists with a firm snap. The sound echoed louder than it should have, carrying a sting of humiliation that pierced even Marcus's composed heart. He had commanded thousands of soldiers, stood in the presence of presidents and world leaders, and yet at this moment, he stood restrained on a quiet street, not because of guilt, but because of suspicion that refused to see beyond his skin and quiet dignity. The murmurs of the bystanders grew. Some gasped, others shook their heads in disbelief. A few even took cautious steps closer, wanting to protest but unsure if they should interfere. Marcus, however, remained calm, his voice steady when he finally spoke again. "Officer, I urge you to reconsider. You are making a mistake." The officer avoided eye contact, guiding Marcus toward the patrol car with brisk, forceful steps. "Save it. You can explain yourself at the station. We'll sort it out there." Marcus did not resist. He walked with measured steps, each one echoing the weight of the moment. The steel of the cuffs bit lightly into his wrists, not from pain, but from the irony of the situation. He had devoted his entire life to protecting the rights and freedoms of citizens, and here he was, restrained by the very system he had sworn to defend. As they approached the patrol car, Marcus glanced at the faces in the crowd. Some looked concerned, others confused, and a few angry. In their eyes, he saw a reflection of the truth. They knew something was wrong. That quiet recognition gave him strength. The officer opened the back door of the car and gestured for Marcus to get in. Marcus paused for a moment, then carefully lowered himself onto the seat. The door shut with a heavy thud, sealing him inside. The tinted windows blurred the view of the outside world, but he could still see the faint outlines of curious faces pressed against the light. Inside the patrol car, silence wrapped around him. The seat was uncomfortable, the air slightly stale, but Marcus sat upright, refusing to slouch or look defeated. His mind, however, raced. He replayed the events of the past half hour, wondering how something so ordinary had escalated so unnecessarily. He thought of his family waiting at home, of the young soldiers who looked up to him, and of the countless times he had spoken about fairness and respect. Tonight he was living proof of why those values mattered more than ever. The officer slid into the front seat, started the engine, and began speaking into the radio. Marcus listened quietly as the officer gave coded updates to the dispatcher, describing him as an uncooperative male suspect. The words stung. Marcus had done nothing but cooperate. He had followed every instruction, spoken respectfully, and yet the narrative being painted about him was one of defiance. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes for a brief moment. It wasn't fear that filled him, but a deep sense of injustice. He knew who he was. He knew the years of service, the countless nights spent away from home, the risks he had taken to safeguard his nation. And yet, all of that was invisible now, dismissed by one person's refusal to look deeper. But Marcus was not a man to lose hope easily. Even in the most challenging missions, he had taught his soldiers that patience and clarity often won battles more than force. And this, he reminded himself, was a battle of perception, of truth against false assumptions. The patrol car rolled forward, the sound of the tires on the road steady and unchanging. Outside, the town passed by in a blur of glowing signs and dimly lit homes. Marcus gazed out the window, his reflection staring back at him. He saw not just himself, but the countless others who had faced moments where respect was denied and dignity tested. Inside, he carried a quiet resolve. He would not allow this moment to break him, nor would he allow it to define him. He knew that the truth always had a way of surfacing, even if it took time. And though the cuffs around his wrists symbolized restriction, his spirit remained free, unshaken, and unyielding. As the car continued its steady drive, Marcus leaned slightly forward, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, when the truth comes out, you will understand the mistake being made tonight." The officer said nothing, keeping his eyes fixed on the road, but his silence spoke volumes. The tension inside the vehicle was thick, yet Marcus felt a strange sense of control. He might have been the one in the back seat, restrained and accused, but he carried within him a strength that no handcuffs could bind. The journey stretched on, each passing moment carrying Marcus further away from the simple peace of his drive home and deeper into a storm of misunderstanding. But even in that storm, his resolve was clear. He would face it with dignity, patience, and unshakable faith in the truth. The ride in the patrol car seemed to stretch on forever. General Marcus Brown sat quietly in the back seat, his wrists still cuffed, the cool metal pressing against his skin. The dim lights of the small town flickered by as the car moved steadily toward the police station. From the outside, he appeared calm, his face composed, his posture upright. But inside, his mind was working carefully, weighing each moment, each choice he would make next. Marcus had always believed that patience was a form of strength. In the army, he had seen young soldiers rush into action without thinking, and often that impatience had cost them dearly. He had taught them that the strongest leaders were the ones who remained steady, even when others lost control. Tonight he was being tested on that very lesson, not on a battlefield overseas, but in the back seat of a police cruiser in his own country. The officer driving glanced occasionally into the rearview mirror, as though expecting Marcus to protest or argue. But Marcus didn't either. He simply met the officer's gaze with steady eyes, saying nothing, letting the silence speak louder than words. That silence unsettled the officer, who finally muttered, "You think you're above the law, don't you?" Marcus didn't flinch. His voice was calm when he replied, "No one is above the law, officer. But the law should be fair to everyone." The officer scoffed and turned his attention back to the road. When they finally arrived at the small station, Marcus was escorted inside. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the faint smell of old paper and coffee filled the air. A few officers at desks looked up curiously as he entered. Their eyes lingered on his dignified posture and composed face, then shifted in surprise to see him handcuffed. Some whispered quietly, clearly wondering why a man like him had been brought in. Marcus was led to a bench near the front desk. The arresting officer began filling out paperwork, still glancing at Marcus with suspicion. After a few minutes, Marcus spoke, his voice even and respectful. "Officer, I would like to make one phone call." The officer looked up, frowning. "You'll get your call later after processing." But Marcus didn't argue. He simply waited, his eyes steady. After a pause, the officer sighed. Perhaps out of routine, perhaps out of curiosity, he finally slid the phone toward him. "Fine, one call." Marcus picked up the receiver with deliberate calm. His hands were still cuffed, making the task awkward, but his voice was firm as he dialed a number he knew by heart. The line rang only once before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Pentagon Operations Desk, who's calling?" "This is General Marcus Brown," he said clearly. "I need immediate confirmation of my identity and communication with my chain of command." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a sudden shift in tone. The voice became sharper, more alert. "Yes, sir. Please hold for just a moment." The arresting officer, standing nearby, smirked as if amused. "Really, the Pentagon? You expect me to believe—" But before he could finish, the voice on the line returned. "General Brown, we have confirmed your location through caller ID. Are you safe?" "Yes," Marcus replied, his tone calm but measured. "I am currently at the local police station. I've been detained under mistaken circumstances. I need this matter clarified immediately." "Understood, General. Stay on the line." The sound of fast-typing keys echoed faintly through the receiver. Within seconds, another voice came on, a commanding one, deep and authoritative. "General Brown, this is Major Collins at the Pentagon. We are contacting the local police chief right now. Remain where you are. This will be resolved immediately." Marcus thanked them with quiet dignity before handing the phone back. The officer, still doubtful, rolled his eyes. "Nice act. You expect me to believe you just called the Pentagon like that?" But before Marcus could reply, the phones at the front desk of the station rang loudly. One officer picked up, his face instantly stiffening as he listened. Another phone rang again, and then another. Suddenly, the quiet station filled with hurried voices, each officer scrambling to respond. The atmosphere shifted sharply. The desk sergeant's face turned pale as he looked toward the arresting officer. "It's the Pentagon. They want to know why General Marcus Brown is in our station right now." The room fell into stunned silence. Every head turned toward Marcus, who sat calmly on the bench, his hands still cuffed but his dignity unshaken. The arresting officer's face lost its confident expression, replaced by confusion and disbelief. The sergeant hurried over, his voice flustered. "Sir, we're verifying your identification now. Please give us a moment." Marcus nodded quietly. "Take all the time you need. The truth doesn't need to be rushed, it stands on its own." Within minutes, faxes, emails, and phone calls confirmed what Marcus had been saying all along. His record was flawless, his position unquestionable, and his service decorated with honors. The Pentagon made it clear. General Marcus Brown was to be treated with the utmost respect and released immediately. The arresting officer stood frozen, his earlier confidence crumbling into visible panic. The cuffs suddenly seemed like the greatest mistake of his career. Slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped forward to unlock them. The sound of the metal releasing was softer than when they had first been snapped on, but its meaning was far louder. Marcus rubbed his wrists gently, though not in anger, only to ease the stiffness. He stood with the same calm composure he had shown throughout, his presence filling the room with quiet authority. He looked directly at the officer, not with rage, but with the kind of steady gaze that reminded a person of their own conscience. "Respect," Marcus said softly, "is not about rank. It is about seeing the humanity in others." The room was silent. Every officer present felt the weight of those words. The Pentagon's representative stayed on the line, ensuring Marcus was safely released. They also made it clear that the matter would not end here. An internal review would begin immediately, and the incident would be reported at the highest levels. Marcus did not gloat, nor did he speak harshly. Instead, he picked up his belongings slowly, thanked the sergeant politely, and walked toward the door. His dignity had never left him, even when the cuffs were locked around his wrists. And now, as he stepped back into the cool night air, it was clear to everyone present that he was a man who carried strength far beyond titles or uniforms. For Marcus, the call to the Pentagon was not about proving his power. It was about proving the truth. And that truth had spoken louder than any suspicion, louder than any doubt. The sound of the station phone still echoed faintly in the air even after they had quieted. The moment the Pentagon had confirmed Marcus's identity, everything inside the small building shifted. Officers who only minutes ago had barely looked up from their desks were now standing straighter, whispering among themselves and sneaking uncertain glances in his direction. The atmosphere had changed from casual dismissal to stunned realization. General Marcus Brown, once handcuffed like an ordinary suspect, now stood free. His wrists were no longer bound, but his dignity had never been restrained. He carried himself with the same calm composure he had shown from the very beginning, his presence alone enough to remind those around him that this was no ordinary man. The arresting officer, however, seemed frozen in place. His face had lost all its earlier confidence. His jaw clenched as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. He had been so certain, so sure of his judgment, that now the truth felt like a tidal wave crashing against his stubbornness. He shifted uneasily, his hand twitching at his side, unable to meet Marcus's steady gaze. The sergeant cleared his throat awkwardly, trying to ease the silence. "General Brown, on behalf of this department, I apologize for what has happened here tonight. There seems to have been a grave mistake." Marcus inclined his head slightly. His voice was calm, but every word carried weight. "Mistakes happen, Sergeant, but how they are handled matters even more." Those words settled into the room like stones dropping into still water. The ripple of truth could be felt in the shifting eyes of the officers, in the way their shoulders tensed, and in the uneasy glances they exchanged. At that moment, the radios on their belts crackled. Dispatch relayed urgent instructions. The police chief was on his way, and higher authorities were already demanding detailed reports. The Pentagon's call had set into motion a chain reaction that no one in that small town could stop. When the police chief finally entered the station, his face revealed both shock and concern. He had been briefed only minutes earlier, and though he tried to maintain a professional composure, his hurried steps betrayed his unease. His eyes landed on Marcus instantly. "General Brown," the chief began, his tone respectful, "please accept my sincere apologies. This should never have happened." Marcus regarded him steadily, not with bitterness, but with quiet authority. "Chief, I respect the work that law enforcement does, but tonight what occurred here was not the law being fairly applied. It was something else." The chief nodded, his face tight with understanding. He turned toward the arresting officer, who now stood stiffly near the desk, his shoulders slumped. "Officer, do you realize what you've done?" The officer swallowed hard, his earlier bravado gone. "Sir, I thought." He trailed off, unable to finish. The weight of his actions had finally begun to sink in. The chief's stern expression deepened. "Your thought nearly turned into a disaster for this department. You detained a United States Army general without cause, ignored valid identification, and created an incident that has now reached the Pentagon itself." The room remained hushed. No one dared to interrupt. Even the sound of the buzzing light seemed louder against the silence. Marcus, however, stepped forward slightly, his presence commanding attention without raising his voice. "Chief, I do not ask for special treatment because of my position. I ask for the same treatment any citizen deserves: fairness, respect, and the assumption of good faith until proven otherwise." Every word was clear, measured, and impossible to dismiss. The chief bowed his head slightly, humbled by the general's dignity. "You are absolutely right, sir, and I assure you, there will be a full investigation into this matter. This behavior does not represent the values we are sworn to uphold." The arresting officer finally lifted his eyes, his face pale. He looked at Marcus, and for the first time his expression revealed something other than suspicion. It showed regret, even shame. He opened his mouth as if to apologize, but the words caught in his throat. The truth was, an apology alone would never erase the image of those handcuffs, nor would it undo the humiliation of doubting a man whose life had been devoted to service. Marcus, however, did not glare at him. Instead, he regarded him with a steady, almost fatherly gaze. "Learn from this," he said quietly. "Let this moment remind you that judgment should not come before understanding. Every person you encounter carries a story. Tonight you misread mine, but tomorrow it could be someone else." The words struck deeply. The officer lowered his eyes, unable to meet the weight of them. The turning point of the night was clear. The power in the room had shifted, not through anger, not through raised voices, but through calm truth that demanded to be acknowledged. Marcus had not needed to shout or argue. His very presence, his unwavering composure, and his unshakable truth had spoken louder than anything else could. One of the younger officers, who had been watching silently from the side, felt compelled to step forward. His voice trembled slightly as he said, "General Brown, I just want to say, I respect what you've done for this country. I'm sorry you were treated this way." Marcus offered a small nod of appreciation. "Thank you. Respect is a two-way street. When we give it freely, it comes back in return." The chief quickly ordered the arresting officer to step into his office for questioning. The sound of the door closing behind them left the rest of the station in a heavy but thoughtful silence. Officers returned to their desks, though their eyes still flicked toward Marcus occasionally, each of them carrying a newfound awareness of the gravity of what had unfolded. Marcus remained composed. He accepted a seat offered to him and waited patiently as the paperwork was hurriedly corrected, the records updated to remove any trace of wrongful detention. He made no demands, no angry speeches, only calm observations that lingered in the minds of everyone present. By the time the chief returned, his expression was even more serious. He extended his hand to Marcus, who shook it firmly. "Sir, I assure you this matter will be reported accurately. The Pentagon has already been briefed, and we will cooperate fully with their review." Marcus nodded. "That is all I ask." As he gathered his belongings, a sense of quiet triumph filled the room. It was not the kind of triumph born from victory over an enemy, but the triumph of truth prevailing over doubt. The turning point had come not from power or force, but from patience, composure, and the strength of character that could not be denied. When Marcus finally stepped out of the station, the cool night air greeted him once again. The crowd outside had thinned, but a few people remained, watching curiously. Some recognized him now, their eyes widening with a mix of respect and embarrassment for having witnessed his mistreatment. He walked to his car slowly, his steps steady and purposeful. Though the events of the night had been heavy, his spirit remained unbroken. He knew this moment would not end here. It would echo beyond this small town, carrying with it a lesson about dignity, fairness, and the consequences of assumptions. For Marcus, the turning point was not about proving who he was to others. It was about reminding himself and everyone around him that integrity shines brightest when tested. And tonight, that truth had turned doubt into realization, arrogance into humility, and silence into a powerful message that would not soon be forgotten. The night had grown quiet by the time General Marcus Brown finally left the police station. The small town street was mostly empty, illuminated only by the soft glow of streetlights and the occasional passing car. Marcus walked calmly to his vehicle, his steps deliberate and composed. Though he had been restrained, doubted, and questioned, the general carried himself with the same dignity and strength he had shown throughout his life. Nothing in that evening had broken his spirit. As he opened the door to his car, his phone vibrated with incoming messages. Reports from the Pentagon confirmed that the incident had been documented and escalated appropriately. His chain of command had been notified immediately, and all relevant departments were coordinating to ensure the event was properly addressed. Marcus read through the messages quietly, nodding slightly at each update. The truth had been validated, but the work was far from over. The arresting officer had been ordered to remain at the station for questioning, and internal affairs were already reviewing the situation. It was clear that the department would need to take corrective measures to prevent such incidents from happening again. Marcus did not relish seeing anyone punished. His concern was for justice, understanding, and learning. He believed that mistakes could become lessons if handled correctly. Driving home, he reflected on the evening's events. He thought about the crowd that had gathered at the station, the bystanders who had silently witnessed the injustice unfold, and the younger officers who had watched quietly from their desks. He knew that their perception of law enforcement had shifted in that moment. They had seen the consequences of assumption, bias, and the failure to verify facts. They had also seen the power of calm, patient, and unwavering truth. When he arrived home, Marcus was greeted by his family, who had been unaware of the situation until they received a call from the Pentagon. His children ran to him, excited but cautious, sensing the unusual tension in their father's demeanor. He embraced them warmly, his voice gentle. "Everything is fine now. The truth has been restored." His spouse looked at him, concern evident in their eyes. "Marcus, are you okay?" That must have been terrifying. Marcus shook his head slightly. It wasn't fear. It was a test of patience, of integrity. I knew who I was, and I knew the truth would come out. That was enough. Later that evening, as he settled into his study, he began to think about the wider implications of the event. This was not just a personal experience. It was a reflection of a larger issue. The world was full of assumptions, many based on appearances rather than facts. The incident highlighted how easily perception could be clouded by bias, and how important it was to approach every situation with fairness and respect. Marcus decided to share his experience publicly, not to draw attention to himself but to educate. He prepared a speech for a press conference and coordinated with Pentagon officials to ensure his story would be presented accurately. He emphasized lessons learned, the importance of integrity in all professions, and the need for continuous training in respect, empathy, and verification. When the press conference took place, Marcus stood before a room filled with journalists, cameras, and microphones. He spoke with calm authority, detailing the incident and highlighting the steps taken to correct it. "What happened tonight could have happened to anyone," he said. It was a reminder that respect is earned not through rank, color, or status, but through understanding, fairness, and the recognition of truth. The media coverage was extensive. News outlets across the country reported on the arrest, the Pentagon's intervention, and the lesson in patience and dignity demonstrated by Marcus. Social media buzzed with reactions, many praising the general for his composure, his commitment to justice, and his ability to turn a personal injustice into a teaching moment. Discussions erupted about law enforcement protocols, the importance of verifying information, and how to address implicit biases in everyday situations. Within the police department, changes were implemented quickly. Officers underwent additional training on verification procedures and the importance of professional conduct. Policies were updated to prevent assumptions from escalating into unnecessary confrontations. The arresting officer received counseling and guidance, and while he faced disciplinary action, he also had the opportunity to learn from the experience. Marcus believed that people could change if they were given the chance, and that education was more powerful than punishment alone. Weeks later, Marcus returned to his regular duties, traveling to military bases, speaking to troops, and mentoring young officers. The incident had strengthened his resolve to teach not only military strategy, but also the values of patience, dignity, and the importance of standing firm in truth. He shared his story in classrooms, lecture halls, and public events, always emphasizing that courage is not only found in battle, but also in moments of restraint and clarity. The general's experience also sparked broader conversations nationwide. Civil rights groups highlighted the event as an example of why training, understanding, and accountability were critical in law enforcement. Community organizations hosted panels and discussions about fairness, respect, and the role of authority in society. Marcus became a symbol of calm resilience, showing that one person's composure could influence not just a small town, but the perspectives of countless people across the country. Despite the public attention, Marcus remained humble. He returned to his family, his routines, and his work, but he never forgot the lessons of that night. He reminded himself and others that every interaction mattered, every choice carried weight, and every individual deserved to be treated with fairness and respect. The aftermath of the incident was not only about personal vindication, it was about societal learning. It reminded people that assumptions could be dangerous, that respect was not optional, and that the truth, when patiently and calmly upheld, could prevail over doubt and ignorance. Marcus had not sought recognition or reward. He had sought to ensure that integrity was honored, that lessons were learned, and that the system could improve for the future. As weeks turned into months, Marcus's story remained a reference point in discussions about law enforcement, leadership, and social responsibility. He continued to travel, speak, and mentor, but the memory of that night stayed with him, not as a source of anger, but as a reminder of the power of patience, composure, and the courage to do what was right even when the world doubted you. In the end, the night that began with suspicion and doubt ended in understanding and respect. Marcus had turned an unjust situation into a teaching moment, showing that dignity, calm, and truth could transform even the most difficult encounters. His story became a beacon of hope, a model for handling adversity, and a lesson in the quiet but powerful strength of character. For General Marcus Brown, the incident would always be remembered, not as a failure of others, but as a triumph of patience, integrity, and the belief that justice, when pursued wisely and calmly, always finds its way.